Gary Gereffi, Professor Emeritus of Sociology at Duke University, has a very rare claim to fame. He helped to coin the phrase global value chains, and our discussion with him focused around the ways in which these interact with the Silk Road economic belt. We discussed the ways in which the Silk Road economic belt may mean that value chains may develop in a more linear rather than regionally clustered fashion, and the ways in which their continual development may result in further threats to national sovereignty.
So my name is Gary Gereffi. I'm at Duke University. I've been here since 1980, and I set up a center on globalization, governance, and competitiveness to develop a framework on global value chains that I had put together with colleagues through something called the Rockefeller Initiative. And last 2017, we retitled that as the Center on Global Value Chains. And I teach courses here in sociology, public policy, business school, dealing with folks interested in globalization and development issues.
And I know it's a very, very big topic, but if you were able to give a brief, sort of your brief 1-minute summary to the emergence of global value chains,
right? How
would you define it?
Global value chains refers to the organization of global industries that were created during the wave of outsourcing and offshoring, or global outsourcing, in the 1970s and 80s, as companies from the US and Europe decided to go abroad to make more of the productions that they were selling. And so the emergence of this global value chain framework, sometimes called global production networks or even global supply chains in business, really helped us understand how international business really became organized around this global factory concept. Production of different parts in different countries, all being organized back to end markets. And understanding the organization of global production is really what global value chains is trying to do.
Thank you. And recently we've seen a rising cost in R&D, slowing growth, rising labour costs. Do you think that countries at the bottom of global value chains, LICs, are at risk of being permanently stuck there as a result?
I think that that's a perennial problem that countries are dealing with, and one of the issues we've identified in our framework is the framework itself has two dimensions. One dimension is called the governance of global value chains, and that's looking at these global industries from the top down, more from a firm perspective, how they're organized, who the lead firms are. But the other side is the upgrading dimension, which is looking at these global chains and the global economy from the bottom up, more from a country perspective. And in that country perspective, one of the first things we had to do was try to identify the different roles that countries can play in these global production networks. And typically when countries first get involved, they get involved in assembly production or export processing zones of different sorts, which is really just leveraging low-cost labor in different countries. But over time, countries, as they advance in these chains, move to what's called full package production or original equipment manufacturing that places like Taiwan and Korea and now China are super well known for. And beyond that, they can do own brand or own design production. And finally, there's this R&D side of it. So the issue of whether you get stuck has to do a lot with a country's resource endowments. Many countries that have come in on the low wage side and just do assembly work do get stuck. And they don't really move beyond assembly. And their factories are often managed by middlemen entrepreneurs from places like Korea, Taiwan, and Hong Kong, who are now expert at setting up factories for the global buyers anywhere around the world. And those countries are just doing a lot of that assembly work. But other countries like China, South Korea, Singapore on the R&D side have been setting up a lot of R&D relationships in these value chains. So, and China, I think, is the clearest case. They say that they're involved in a race to the top, not a race to the bottom, because they've put in a lot of R&D centers. But in the China case, it was controversial because those were mandated. China was basically telling multinationals from the mid-2000s, if you want to work in China, if you want to set up production facilities, we want you to set up an R&D center as well. And that was a way to kind of create forced technology transfer.
If we could look at this from the flip side in terms of knowledge absorption, and with the internet and globalization, it's easier for less developed countries to absorb knowledge. What implications would that have for countries like China, which are quickly moving through the value chains, or even countries in the developed world who are at the top of them?
So I think there's at least two big implications. One might be this idea of national or regional innovation systems. For countries to be able to retain this knowledge, they really need to have a university system for knowledge creation in terms of training graduates and developing R&D labs domestically. So that helps anchor or link these R&D centers to local sources of knowledge creation. But the other key dimension is the firm capability side, that all these supply chains are really basically interfirm networks. And you've got companies in all these different countries that are linked to one another. So the countries like China or Korea that are quite good at generating a lot of local R&D, they do it because their own domestically owned firms have big R&D centers and focus on acquiring patents and pushing the technology frontier. So I think on the one hand, you're trying to train workers and a population that's capable of working in companies that are doing high-tech work. But on the other hand, in the end, you need local companies, and that's a big issue for China in particular, because they've done a lot of their exporting and their value chain successes on the backs of foreign investors. And so China's big challenge is creating companies that have the capacity to absorb and create their own knowledge.
A theory which has been sort of suggested is that the Belt and Road Initiative is a geo-industrial strategy to move China up the global value chains and move antiquated industries and methods to other countries. Would you postulate any countries which may be the predecessors in the role of producing massive amounts of components and manufactured goods which China wants to move away from?
Yeah, I think that East Asia in particular has had a very rich ecosystem of countries involved in these higher tech industries. We take one step back, Belt and Road Initiative itself, the industries that it's focusing on in terms of infrastructure development aren't necessarily the high-tech industries. And a lot of what Belt Road Initiative is doing is focusing, in China's case, on heavy industries related to construction, things like cement, the railway industries, the road construction industries, ports. And so in that case, I think China's had a very big interest in developing regional and kind of cross-regional infrastructure networks. I think on the high-tech side, China's Made in China 2025 strategy is much more geared to developing technology connected to the digital economy and other things. In terms of predecessors, I think clear predecessors, you really have to think regionally. I think the first predecessor was Japan. Of course, in the 1950s, after World War II, Japan, in trying to rebuild its economy, focused a lot on exports, and Japan moved people forget that Japan in the 50s, a lot of its exports to the U.S. were apparel. And they didn't move into industries like automobiles and electronics until a little bit later, but because Japan had such a well-developed industrial base, I think they made that transition really quickly. And then as Japan started to move into these higher tech industries, they took some of their lower tech and more polluting industries like footwear and apparel, textiles, leather goods, and they moved them into Korea and Taiwan, very, very specifically. And so I've done tracking on that in footwear, and it's very clear that the Japanese trading companies like Mitsubishi and others were involved in offloading these industries in the mid-60s and 70s into Korea, Taiwan, which gave those countries a leg up in terms of beginning to set up their own international production networks. And then Korea and Taiwan, along with Singapore, Hong Kong, became critical predecessors of China in particular. So in a sense, we've got over several decades, a kind of an evolution or upgrading where it's a little bit like the flying geese pattern. Japan was up front. And then you've got some of these East Asian NICs or newly industrializing economies like Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, Hong Kong. But there's definite differences in each of those four in terms of what they were able to do. China has tried to pick up part of that legacy. And even today, when you look at China iPhone exports, which is one of those classic or smartphone exports in general, China's imported components for that comes to a large degree from some of these surrounding East Asian economies. And so China's strategy is how to get more of those imported inputs made in China, initially by joint ventures and then by Chinese-owned firms. So China is on a very rapid value capture strategy, I think, but focusing a lot on its Asian neighbors.
And of course it's something that precedes the Belt and Road, but China with its policy making can open up industrial cooperation to countries before companies. What implications does this have for global value chains if things are open to a country before the companies, which is how it works in the developed world?
I think in particular with, more generally, this pattern of working with countries has been part of what regional trade agreements were all about and market access programs. So if you just took a step back in apparel and you looked at how so many countries in the developing world became significant apparel exporters in the 80s and 90s, a lot of it came from trade agreements, where the EU would have preferential tariffs for a set of former colonies. U.S. had similar agreements with Central America, Mexico, et cetera. What those agreements did is that they allowed countries that were doing some of this assembly production or export processing zone work to export their outputs duty-free into the rich developed country markets. And U.S. did that with Mexico, very specifically with their border industrialization program up to 65, and then this Maquila program from 65 all the way till NAFTA, and then NAFTA was another chapter in that. In China's case, I think there's similar country-to-country agreements in Asia. I think China has been playing this card of which countries are on the one China policy side of the spectrum and which countries recognize Taiwan. And China, so for example, in Central America, Costa Rica recognizes one China. China was willing to build a soccer stadium in Costa Rica just because of that. When the soccer stadium was built, the Costa Ricans later discovered that 30,000 Chinese workers were going to stay behind and form a colony in Costa Rica. So a lot of the largesse obviously has strings attached. I think it was Nicaragua actually did not have a one-child China policy. They recognized Taiwan, so Taiwan investors would come in and work closely with Nicaraguan factories. So I think part of this is actually surprisingly still a legacy of the China-Taiwan conflict in terms of each country trying to offer other countries some competitive benefits. I think, final point about China, with Belt and Road, another reason why the country-to-country agreements are important is because much of China's investment goes through state enterprises. And the state enterprises as public entities, I think, can follow quite nicely on country-to-country agreements, whereas when you're dealing with private companies, as is true of most GVCs are around multinationals and FDI, foreign direct investment. And in private firms, they use those country-to-country agreements in more flexible ways, I think.
And if we could stay on the topic of the Belt and Road just for a little bit longer. The Silk Road Economic Belt is aspiring to build economic corridors in a linear way from what I understand across China, Central Asia, West Asia, or across the New Euro-Asian land bridge. And you seem to have stressed the importance of global value chains in a more clustered regional way. Do you think the establishment of these linear pathways could change the dynamics and the implications that may have for delivery and efficiency and production lines across geographies?
I mean, you're absolutely right that the Geography of Belt Road Initiative is incredibly ambitious, going all the way from China to Europe. And I think it means that we need to really have a kind of interregional and somewhat more linear or sequential perspective. I think global value chains actually has no trouble with shifting geographies because the geography of global value chains has always been a variable. In some cases, these regional concentrations, like in East Asia for electronics or North America for automobiles, certain value chains have a very clear regional stamp, or aerospace in Europe. But other value chains can be global or it could be interregional, like Belt Road, or in some cases are even local. I mean, in big countries like Brazil or India or China, a lot of the developments around building capabilities and can occur around a particular cluster. And so initially when the global value chain approach got created back in early 2000s, it kind of came from this Rockefeller Global Value Chain Initiative that brought together a lot of local cluster researchers with people who were looking at global commodity chains or global industries. And the idea was, how can the global value chains approach link global local in such a way where the geography can be malleable? And so I think in Belt Road Initiative, it indeed, we have to take account of those different regional geographies. And I think from a GVC perspective, we'd probably do it in two ways. One, we'd look inside each of those regions, China in East Asia or Central Asia or South Asia, all the way to Europe, and you might find particular dynamics that are very relevant, China, Bangladesh, or China, Pakistan. But when you then link them all together, I think it creates a different architecture. And that means maybe you go beyond what single industries can do. I mean, what global value chains would add to that discussion is probably the role that the interfirm networks or create in terms of economic efficiencies, but it also raises the question of the kind of political pushback on those investments that we've seen whenever you look at global value chains that are trying to get entrenched in particular countries, and then the countries have their own development priorities. So part of what GVCs have been trying to do is provide tools to country policymakers to understand how their changing role in the global economy might lead to different kinds of policy issues they want to confront.
Do you think global value chains undermine the significance or importance of the nation state when you have a ambiguity about imports and exports, about FDI, and the way that your priorities are spread through a number of countries rather than as they've traditionally been in a single?
It's a great question. I think at one level it does. It kind of goes back. In my case, the people I worked with most closely when I was doing doctoral and postdoctoral work was a guy named Raymond Vernon at Harvard, who had a big multinational enterprise project in the late 60s, early 70s. And his most famous book was called Sovereignty at Bay. And just talking about multinationals, not about global value chains per se. It was kind of one sort of almost a precursor to global value chains, was how multinational companies in the 50s and 60s were setting up these supply chains or production networks. And one of his theses was, indeed, multinationals do put national sovereignty at risk because they can coordinate for economic purposes across borders things that individual countries would like to control. And I think we see it from natural resource investments where countries like Canada didn't want to be told who they could export wheat to. So back in the early days, the US would like to tell Canada if they had American multinationals with Canadian subsidiaries that they shouldn't be exporting to the Soviet Union back in Cold War days, all the way up to the internet. With internet governance right now, it's the same question. It's sometimes now called informational sovereignty. Does the creation of the internet and global value chains built around the internet restrict countries' ability to assert sovereignty over who controls information in their borders?
There's been a couple of words that have been mentioned quite a lot during this conversation: eco-chains, global value chains, networks, global value chains. I've never been clear exactly how you define something like globalization. Is it something that's interchangeable with networks and global value chains, or is it a concept that's bigger?
I think that globalization, how we define it, globalization is about flows of knowledge, people, products, et cetera. I think that's one of the easiest ways to understand globalization. And in the economic realm, some people have talked about globalization of finance preceding a lot of the globalization of production. Another dimension is the trade thing. So globalization is also can be discussed in terms of all these international trade networks. So when one just starts to see an organization like World Trade Organization defining trade rules across countries, in a sense they're creating the rules-based architecture for globalization to work on the trade side. Where global value chains come in is on the production side. So in a sense, the foundation of a global value chain is a global supply chain. Very traditional business idea of an input-output structure, starting with raw materials to components to final good to distribution to end market. And companies have always had to pay attention to those issues, and usually companies are only part of that input-output structure, depending on whether they're making the raw materials or the components or whether they're the shippers or the retailers. So what global value chains did is it put together all of these different company actors in a supply chain and then said, now, how do we analyze how that supply chain has been changing under globalization? So what globalization did is it took the supply chain that was often looking at things like trade between countries. So the certain countries specialized in the raw materials and others in the components and others in the final goods. So prior to 1970, most of international trade was just countries trading with one another final goods that they made in their country. Global supply chains or global value chains began to emerge in the 70s and 80s with actually in the 60s onward. The whole idea that firms began to realize that they could outsource parts of their production to lower cost countries. And once you started to create an international production network, could be regional, could be global, then we started to give these supply chains more of an international configuration. And the two overlays, I would say, is one overlay is if you look at a supply chain and you put companies into it, the first step of global value chains, the governance issue was who has the power in those chains to control the way the chain works. And then we introduced the idea of lead firms and ideas of producer-driven chains and buyer-driven chains, having different types of lead firms, and that governance got more sophisticated over time. And the value chain adds on to the power dimension, being able to say, okay, and how much value is being added at each step in that chain, so that we can then talk about countries trying to create more value capture. So if China, as those earlier statistics would tell us about the iPhone chain, was only getting 2% of the retail price of an iPhone because they were just assembling it. Well, from a value chain point of view, now China's saying, well, why should Apple get 40? Apple's going to get 40% of the iPhone, and China's going to get 2%. And China makes all the goods, and Apple just designs them. How do you reconfigure that so China captures more? And it partly means they have to create more knowledge, et cetera. So I think we've got this layering with supply chain being the tangibles, commodity chains being the power arrangements, and sort of the idea of who drives the chains. And then value chain trying to better understand how the creation of value works across those chains. So it's like rasters and a system, layer on layer on layer. Each layer is adding another dimension, and each layer requires a different kind of measurement.
Okay, if we look at supply chains then, and an article that struck me was a Bloomberg article last year which looked at the vulnerability of the technological supply chain with the inserting of spying equipment into microchips and things. I find global value chains, if we can broaden this out again, is talked a lot like democracy or globalization, sort of Fukuyama's of democracy, where there's sort of these inexorable forces. Do you see global values chains as something that will indefinitely proliferate, or do you think examples like that, the vulnerability of strategic sectors, will limit them?
I think, yes, they can certainly be limited in many ways. I guess I'd say two things. Yes, they can be limited by changes in political arrangements. So, for example, the economic nationalism we're seeing now, Brexit, breaking the sort of regional trade agreements, all of that, those political decisions clearly reconfigure how these value chains, supply chains work. If you start getting security concerns like the one you just mentioned with these microchips, then countries are going to insert much tougher controls over who's going to allow technology and FDI to occur. So the U.S. has already told, Chinese can't buy certain ports because they're worried about security, or other countries have the. So I think there's plenty of potential for political reshaping of value chains. But similarly, I think the thing value chains would sort of call out again is, how do business logics change when political logics change? And I think, in other words, how do the strategies of the different players in the value chains, how are they reorganized? And then I think the global value chain approach really grew out of international development research, not international business. And you could look at it both ways. International business is just, how do we better understand this from a strategic decision-making point of view of companies? But a lot of the concern of value chain researchers have been people working in developing countries who have firms that are linked to multinational firms, that are linked to these global trade and investment and financial and R&D flows. And so another way to anchor the kind of use the value chain framework for a particular set of questions are those that are coming out from developing country policymakers that are feeling like they're stuck, they're frozen. And so I think that there's nothing, bottom line, there's nothing inexorable about the value chains. These determinants, technological, political, business strategy, or policymaker oriented. So value chains, I think that its greatest contribution is going to be probably trying to provide a tool to policymakers and decision makers about how the changing configurations create opportunities or threats for particular groups in the chain, including things like workers. I mean, it's interesting that the ILO, International Labor Organization, in the mid-90s was the first big international organization to appreciate the importance of a global supply chain approach to their interest in global production and local jobs.
The Belt and Road Initiative and both Made in China 2025, maybe more the Belt and Road Initiative, seem to be having some success in playing a greater role in strategic industries, shipbuilding, acquisition of ports, building railways, but it seems to be having less success at the moment at aviation, at dredging, at some of these high technology capture fields that it wants to get into. Can you put a timeline on how long it may take to acquire some of these industries, or is it impossible to say?
Well, I don't think Belt and Road Initiative would be intended to try to deal with some of those higher tech industries like aviation, in the sense that you look at the original 68 countries or so that are on the list for China, many of those countries are very poor. And to me, China's play is how to use those countries to create a land bridge or a sea bridge to some of their key markets.
Do you not think that they're linked, though, in terms of the acquisition of a port? May that be Habitoto or Piraeus or Guardia also presents the opportunity for dredging and things of that nature. I think I agree with you that it's more about building land bridges and infrastructure investment, but can that not lead to higher value involvement?
It could, but in some ways I think China would get there. If China was interested, how do you modernize aerospace, they would probably focus on a different set of countries to accelerate that. For example, UAE and Middle Eastern countries in general have a big problem not having a big enough workforce and a big enough domestic population to spark manufacturing. And they're very worried what's going to happen when oil runs out. So the UAE actually put in place a program to build a big aerospace industry, because UAE is, I think, the second biggest country of jumbo jets, commercial airliners. So they used that leverage with Airbus and Boeing to have those companies help devise a strategy whereby UAE could set up factories to make aerospace parts. I think that China has those same kinds of leverages, but I think that they can get into things like aerospace through other channels. To me, the biggest, I think, unseen problem perhaps that the Belt and Road is raising for China is that because so many of the countries that they're dealing with are very low income countries, and the projects like ports and railroads, are big ticket items. China's already running into a problem where the loans that they're issuing countries aren't going to be repaid on time. So then the question is, who will get control? How will China deal with that? And I think the early signs with that Sri Lankan port and China saying, well, if you can't repay, then you give us a 99-year agreement, seems to make some people think that a bigger sort of endogenous or built-in objective of Belt and Road is not just the creation of the land bridge, but the opportunity to create outposts for China in terms of the infrastructure that they're creating. If other countries can't pay for it and China's provided the money, China could then say, well, we assert control. And I think that's, and a couple other issues like that, are embroiling China much more quickly than they ever thought into kind of international political disputes. I think they might have really thought this is just an economic deal, or at least we want to sell it as an economic deal, but it's become a geopolitical, I think it can become a geopolitical nightmare for China, and dealing with local country development agendas that China didn't think it was really buying into.
So you don't think it was part of sort of a grand strategy, a sort of loan-to-own strategy wasn't intended?
I don't know that it was, probably wasn't, certainly wouldn't have been first order. I think people might have thought this could be second order benefit, it might happen. But I think probably, so I think canny people could have thought, okay, this is a possibility and we could take advantage. I think maybe what wasn't really anticipated hardly at all was the fact that other countries are going to say, okay, well, if you're going to build this facility in Africa or in Pakistan or wherever, so what percentage of my workforce is going to be involved? And now and then China would say, but your workforce isn't qualified. And the country said, I don't care, that we need this. And this is exactly the kind of issue that British investment in overseas and US investment in Latin America throughout the 19th century started to run into again and again. All the claims that this foreign investment, as you move into big infrastructure and natural resource-based industries, is a form of neo-imperialism. On many levels, explicit or unexplicit, intended or unintended. And I think, in a sense, Belt Road Initiative can fall into exactly that dynamic with many of these countries, that it's going to be perceived even by the developing countries, not just by China's competitors like Japan or Korea or the US, but even with developing countries, they're going to begin to say, okay, you're asserting control over critical nodes in our country, we're getting very little for it, and now you're going to turn the screws. And I think that's why organizations like USAID and DFID in Britain were created, in a sense, to help those countries on their bilateral aid transfers figure out how do you deal with these development demands that are going to come your way if you're trying to push FDI.
I know we're broadening it out a little bit here, but in terms of British, Chinese railway diplomacy, if we call this current strategy, could you draw any comparisons with something like British gunboat diplomacy in the 19th century?
Sure. I mean, in many ways, with gunboat diplomacy, I mean, Britain would be able to say, because we have the capacity to trade, we want to force you to be a partner in that, whether you're willing or not. And similarly, I think that China, with Belt Road Initiative, is sort of saying, because we have the capacity to build infrastructure through your country that will help connect you to us and others, we still want to do it on our terms. I mean, or China has its agenda. Other countries may, and China would probably want to sell it to other countries to say, look, this is also going to help you, if you're talking about sub-Saharan Africa, export your goods to other markets. But see, I think another key part of this that, and I don't know, since Belt and Road Initiative investments were already starting in the early 2000s, well before when it was announced, it's kind of a rebranding right now. But part of the very current dimension of Belt and Road is that it can also be seen as a way to lessen China's dependence on North America. In a sense, where's the protectionist threat coming from? And China and the US are the two big digital economy countries right now. They're pushing these, Industry 4.0 kind of technologies. Germany's in that same mix. But I think another way to interpret Belt and Road is it's an effort by China to redirect a lot of its production to markets that are less demanding, less protectionist than the U.S. is turning out to be. And so it can have that effect. Again, it can be a second or third order. It might not have been why they initially wanted to do it. I think initially they just have all these heavy industries. They had saturated Chinese demand for railroads, or they started to move to the lower, less desirable projects. So the idea of moving that production capacity and those resources internationally makes a lot of sense, even just as a way to deal with gluts that you have in the domestic economy.
Would you then draw a parallel between the onset of the financial crisis and China having to produce all the surplus capacity and this current, what could be considered a geo-industrial strategy with BRI? Do you think the way we're seeing it formulated at the moment is very causally linked to?
I think they're connected. I think it's definitely a multi-causal direction, but I think a lot of it is China, in a sense, having succeeded probably beyond what it could have ever imagined in the early 90s with the export push approach. And I think it was more the 2008-2009 economic crisis, the trade crisis, not so much a financial crisis, where China was unable, where the U.S. and Europe, because of Lehman Brothers and the whole sort of downturn, it was a financial component, then it became a kind of trade component, and the concern that trade plummeted. When that hit in 2008, 2009, thousands and thousands of Chinese factories had to close because they didn't have those external markets. And I think that really made China aware of the vulnerabilities created by an export-first development model. And since those companies that were exporting had also developed many capabilities connected with being able to produce those goods and export them and move up the value chain in terms of their own brands and some more design, I think China really realized that turning to the internal market, and it's not just China, I think the BRICS and emerging economies in general, Brazil, even Mexico, China, India, I think they all saw the globalization as an export promotion agenda is partial and vulnerable to many other shocks. So they've moved inward. And I think BRI is then an extension of that. When China says, let's use our domestic market more as a source of demand, but then you realize that that domestic market for certain infrastructure projects has also been pretty heavily sort of saturated. The question then is how to guarantee outward inflows of natural resources that China continues to need, and BRI, how to connect up to these new markets. And I think it's also not just connecting to Europe, but visualizing Central Asia, South Asia, et cetera, as new markets for these kinds of industries needed to build infrastructure. So much is around construction. I think Korea probably, and Turkey both, and India, Korea, Turkey, India, all have big international construction industries. And they might have been motivated, that would be an interesting parallel to see when those countries' international construction efforts, like building the oil pipelines in the Middle East, a lot of that was done by, I think, Indians and Turkish construction companies. So I think a lot of the emerging economies in these regions have turned to outward pushes for construction as a way to use a lot of local materials. And what China probably does maybe a little differently than some of those others is they also can export the workforce. To some degree, I don't know whether Korea, I don't think Korea was in a position to necessarily export Korean workers or Turkey, but if the countries were close enough, maybe some of that could occur.
And just to wrap up,
Yeah.
if you were going to summarize if you're happy to, the Belt and Road Initiative in one word, and also if you're able to, an image, what would those be to you? One word I would be for Belt and Road would be obviously connections. I think another word would be overexpansion. Another word would be vulnerabilities. I think those three takes on BRI are all connected. It is trying to connect these other regions, and that's a very ambitious agenda that can serve China well. I think that it is easily subject to overexposure, overexpansion.
in some ways, because not over because China can't handle it, but over expansion because these other countries can't absorb it. And it's going to create, as we were saying earlier, some political tensions. And I think vulnerability precisely on the political side. I think the fact that BRI is going to be seen by other countries as a debt trap in one case, or as an overextension and China trying to get military bases elsewhere. It might not have been part of China's original plan, but as long as other countries can use some of those events to fit their narrative. So that's what I would, and image, I think we've had these great visual maps of the sort of the belt and the, I mean, it's funny because the words belt and road don't really capture the seagoing side of it, don't capture the multiple strands. So it's hard to, but I like the maps of the flows going north and south and how, so to me, the image would be those maps. I mean, how China gets connected in all these ways with all these regions.